evening. Thank you for coming. Once again, we're fortunate to have a highly regarded and well-known speaker for our colloquium series. And today we're very pleased to invite our renowned Middle East expert, Ben Radd. Professor Radd's a lecturer in law at UCLA Law School, a lecturer in global studies at the UCLA International Institute, a senior fellow at the Berkel Center for International Relations, a teaching fellow at UCLA Center for Middle East Development, and a security fellow at the Truman National Security Project. He's an expert on international relations, the politics of the Middle East with an emphasis on Iran. You may have seen him. He appears frequently on numerous national and worldwide news networks, BBC, CNBC, Fox, NBC, ABC, France 24, and many others. He also, in addition to his teaching duties, Professor Radd is the founder and CEO of Fascination Labs. Sorry. That's okay. Fascination Lab, an educational and experiential learning consulting firm. And in 2023, he was hired to design a political crisis simulation that was filmed and released as an award-winning documentary called War Game, which was selected to premiere at the Sundance Film Festival and was a New York Times film pick for 2024. Today he's going to speak about modern methods of warfare, the rise of non-state actors, and the differing ways in which the new kinds of warfare we have raise implications for international law, war crimes, legal limits. Are there legal limits on modern warfare, or are there not, and the like? And I'm sure he will also respond to any questions you might have, for example, on Iran or even the Ukraine. So I'd like to now introduce Benjamin Radd.
Thank you. Thank you to Jay. Thank you to all the members here for having me join you all. Bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to pull up. There it is. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here. When I first conceived of this topic a few weeks ago, actually longer than that, it's amazing. I don't need to tell any of you how fast the world changes on a day-by-day or hour-by-hour basis. So this topic, though the title stays the same, some of the themes I will address have evolved, and they've evolved to reflect a lot of what's happened in the last 7 days, 10 days, and I'll bring in elements of that into the discussion. So it's going to veer a little bit from what Jay described, but not too much. It's going to stay, I think, consistent with the overall theme. And so before I begin, there are two quotes that really stood out to me. The first one is from Montesquieu, and he says, "There are but two just causes of war, one to repel an enemy, the other to assist an injured ally." And then there's one from Henry Kissinger, who said famously, "Mistakes were quite possibly made by the administration in which I served." Now, Dr. Kissinger was referring to allegations of war crimes committed by the US in its activities in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Latin America when he was asked, and that was his response. So, famous for deflecting in that way. So whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Eastern Europe, whether it's Latin America, these areas, these regions of the world and other places have all seen conflict. They've all seen wars, both silent and loud, hot and cold, declared, undeclared, symmetrical and asymmetrical. And what I want to discuss about is the limits of warfare in international conflicts with respect to how these wars are conducted. I'm going to emphasize the discussion on genocide in particular because it's the one that has gained the most attention in recent years. And it's how and where the concept of genocide is applied, the issues, the controversies surrounding it, specifically whether the emphasis should be placed on protecting individuals or groups. That is a distinction that matters. I'm going to get into why that matters. And as a general point of reference, the conflicts in Russia, Ukraine, and Israel-Palestine will be the focus here, in large part because, again, that's where we now see active discussion about genocide, in addition to other crimes listed either within the ICC or the ICJ. I'll talk about those two bodies as well. I'm going to try to refrain from making any judgments here about the conflicts in both those spheres with respect to these criminal concepts that we're going to discuss. One thing that I want all of you to keep in mind as I'm discussing this, though, is what does it mean to have a supranational judicial body hold a sovereign state to account for what it does within its borders or territory? Does it mean that there truly is no such thing as state sovereignty? We're going to come back to this question later. I'm probably going to end with that question somewhat. So with that, let's start with where any discussion, any real discussion of the modern concept of international criminal law with respect to war crimes and genocide and other matters like that starts, and that's going to be with the Nuremberg Tribunal, otherwise known as the International Military Tribunal for Nuremberg, 1945. It really ran over several years, but it began in 1945, the most famous one being the one you're seeing here, which had what were the surviving members of, the senior members of the Nazi government brought to trial. And prosecutors from the 4 Allied countries that were victorious, the United States, United Kingdom, Soviet Union, and France, they needed to invent new crimes in light of everything that had happened in World War II, in light of everything that the Nazis had done. Prior to the International Military Tribunal, we only had the following crimes as part of international law. You have piracy, slave trade or slavery, war crimes, which were the laws and customs of war based on the Hague and Geneva Conventions. You have crimes against peace, which means basically waging an aggressive war, but note that there was no enforcement mechanism for this particular one. And that's it. These are the crimes that we had going into Nuremberg. For the victorious Allies, when they wanted to bring the Nazi leadership to account for their crimes, they decided that this wasn't enough or that it needed to be expanded. So for the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, they added additional crimes. These include crimes against peace, which is waging aggressive war, but this time with an enforcement mechanism, meaning a way to actually punish and enforce the party that's guilty. You have war crimes, again, and this means violations of law and the customs of war. You had a new crime invented called crimes against humanity. And this included things like murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, etc., against civilians, not against other military forces. But what's missing from the International Military Tribunal? There is, exactly, and I heard it whispered here, there is no crime of genocide. The Nazis, let's be clear, were not charged with genocide. But it's a bit more complicated than that. So what happens after the International Military Tribunal? We know that most of the Nazis you saw in that picture were held to account. Some of them committed suicide after they were sentenced or while they were being tried, so they never actually got to face justice in that way. In 1946, the United Nations General Assembly gathers, and it affirms that genocide is now a distinct crime under international law. So prior to 1946, it was not. The concept was only invented in 1945, and I'll discuss that in a moment. So in 1948, right, what you have is that the crime of the war crimes committed by the Nazis genocide was subsumed under war crimes and crimes against humanity, meaning the indictment against the Nazis included the word genocide in it, but it was a means through which the Nazis committed these other crimes that you see here, war crimes and crimes against humanity. It was not a standalone crime. So when the UN gathers in 1948, they create a binding legal document called the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And it is here that it is for the first time legally codified, put into writing, and it serves as the model for all future tribunals, including many years later, the ICC, the International Criminal Court. So since this is a very important document, and it's important for many reasons, but chief among them is that it's been in the news recently, and it is the document, this convention, that is holding both the governments of Russia and of Israel to account for their activities. I think it's important that we look at it and understand, especially the relevant section that discusses what the crime of genocide is. So that's going to be in Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Article 2 defines genocide as follows, and this definition is very important. It says, and this is verbatim from the document, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, which I've highlighted, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And then it goes on to list the acts. It starts with killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and lastly, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, these are the requisite crimes. So in order to be charged with genocide, the prosecution has to prove, or to be convicted, I should say, of intent. Was in the news yesterday when the United Nations released its report on the situation in Gaza. Here is the headline from yesterday's New York Times. Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, a UN inquiry says. And the relevant passage from the article, and it says, in the months since it issued its last report, Commission members assessed whether the evidence they gathered met the requirements of the Geneva Convention. Under the International Court of Justice's standard for genocide to be declared, it must be the only inference that could reasonably be drawn from the acts in question. In the report released on Tuesday, the UN panel said that that was the case in Gaza. So this is a panel of investigators. It is not a legal binding opinion. These investigators have looked at what they saw in Gaza, and they said, there's no other inference to explain what we're seeing. Not one of self-defense, not one of survival, not one of rescuing hostages, nothing. The only reason that we can see that Israel is doing any of what it's doing is genocide, per the definition I gave you. This commission will send this report now to the judges on the International Court of Justice, where they will read the report and hear from the other side as to why it's not true, or the counter-argument, and decide for themselves. But this was important because yesterday, these very same concepts I've been talking about, since, that have been an issue since 1948, came up. So we have this dilemma over intent and its usage. But there is a broader and more philosophical dilemma over one of identity. So you see, the crime of genocide is distinctly a crime against a group. It is literally in the definition. The definition says a group. The group was classified as either national, ethnical, racial, or religious. And remember, political groups are not included in this protection. Nevertheless, this definition that we now have is focused on the group. That is what Lemkin wanted, as he believed that the crimes of the Nazis in particular, but also the Turks before them, the Ottoman Turks against the Armenians, were clearly targeted at specific groups within their territory. They didn't target, the Ottoman Turks didn't target people because they were people, but because they were Armenians. The same thing with what the Nazis did to the Jews that came within the occupied parts of Europe. These crimes, Lemkin maintained, represented the failure of international law to protect citizens or residents from their own government. Lemkin believed, there he is here, Lemkin believed strongly that a new legal system was needed to protect these vulnerable groups in the future. He said the state is too powerful. We can't trust the state. We can't leave it unchecked to wage murderous campaigns against people within its borders. The hell with sovereignty. They cannot justify it based on state sovereignty, right? The Ottoman Turks said, these Armenians are our citizens or residents in our territory. We can do with them and treat them as we will. The Nazis made the same argument. Lemkin says that's unacceptable. Wiping away this idea that what a state does within its own sovereign borders should be left to the state alone. Lemkin wanted to address several fundamental questions. First, how do you protect people from their own rulers? And two, what do you do if you don't have a state of your own to protect you? That's what the Armenians under the Ottoman Empire endured. That's what the Jews of Eastern Europe and Central Europe endured, and that's what the Palestinians are enduring today. They lack a state to protect them and to enforce international law. This might make sense to us, but Lemkin's view at the time, as I mentioned, went contrary to conventional wisdom, and specifically, it was inconsistent with a leading theory that was being advocated by one of his contemporaries, a man by the name of Hirsch Lauterpacht. Now, Hirsch Lauterpacht, like Lemkin, was a Polish-Ukrainian Jew who was educated in the exact same law school in Lviv, in what is now Ukraine, at the same time. There's a remarkable story in the book East-West Street by the renowned international lawyer Philippe Sands, and he talks about this. And these two men are essentially the godfathers of international law as we know it, and yet they never met each other. Their paths never directly crossed until they got to the Nuremberg trials, and they developed two very different views of international law, specifically on this concept of genocide. Where Lemkin invents and introduces the crime of genocide, going into the Nuremberg trials, Lauterpacht presents an alternative conception, which he called crimes against humanity. Just as with genocide, this crime of crimes against humanity was a legal concept that didn't exist before 1945, the same year that Lemkin came up with genocide. So both of these concepts are crystallized and advocated and explained in the same time, 1945, 1946. Crimes against humanity refers to widespread attacks and atrocities committed against civilians during, even and especially during peacetime. This includes things like I mentioned earlier, murder, mass extermination, enslavement, deportation, done against civilians. Lauterpacht's motivation was as follows. If what we are concerned with is the unchecked power of the state or any other occupying force over its own people, then what we are really talking about is containing the destructive abilities of a group in power. And that group can be a government, it can be a party, it could be a militia, it could be a movement. Doesn't matter. So he's saying if what we are trying, so he says if we're approaching this from the perspective of group victimization, which is what genocide does, it doesn't help address the underlying concern of protecting individuals from their rulers. To that end, he said, what is needed is recognition and protective of individuals as themselves. Why do we need to attach them to groups? He says if we focus on groups, all we are doing is substituting the state with the group, basically one replacing the other. He says we need to stop making this about groups because in the end, these are all individual human lives that are equally precious and must be equally worthy of protection, regardless of how they classify themselves. And ultimately, who gets to classify what is a protected group? Who gets to decide what that is? For years, the Palestinians were not deemed a protected group. The Uyghurs in China, there's many others in other parts of the world who suffer from similar fates. The Kurds, more or less, are an unprotected group. You could say the same about the Druze. So this raises all kinds of issues when we get into group dynamics. When we start defining crimes and limits on warfare and how countries can conduct themselves based on the groups, we start creating a different kind of problem. Now, Lemkin countered and said, group identity has a worth, it has a value, that groups are culturally and socially significant, and they are worth protecting. In fact, he says, if they weren't significant, how else would you explain the motive behind Hitler's final solution? It was specifically targeted at a group. It wasn't just individuals. Hitler didn't care about the individuality of his victims of the Third Reich. He cared about their group affiliation, in this case being Jews or of Jewish ancestry. For Lauterpacht, he responded, genocide reinforces and empowers group identity, which he sees as a destructive force overall, one that we want to move away from. Under Lemkin's conception, he says, and I am repeating this, you are replacing the state with the group, one authority with another. He prefers, again, the idea that every human being has rights under international law above all else. These are two very profound differences with major implications that to this day have not been resolved. It still sits with us. How do we approach these situations? So, and to repeat another important point, not a single nation or leader has been convicted of the crime of genocide, ever. Even in the case of Serbia, which was the most sort of egregious and easy example to point to, the International Court of Justice held that genocide took place under their watch, under Serbian leadership, but that it wasn't the Serbian leadership that directly ordered it or carried it out. There were other groups, militia groups, ethno-nationalist groups that did it, and the Serbians were responsible for not stopping them, but they themselves did not commit these acts, therefore they cannot be held guilty or account of genocide. Only that they failed to stop it. And so again, this is what I want us to all pause and reflect on when we are weighing whether to bring and prosecute charges of genocide against any state today, in particular Russia and Israel. That are we prepared to hold those two countries at a status of guilt that exceeds every other country or leader that has come before them, going all the way back to the Nazis, not a single one of whom was held to account for the crime of genocide. Are these going to be the first two? Is that the example that we're going to set? This is the question that we have to answer. Now I've mentioned Israel, for whom charges of genocide have been introduced at the international courts, but there's also Russia. We've seen what they've done in Ukraine. We know what the Serbians have done. The court said no genocide here. We know Rwanda, the court said no genocide there. And the Uyghurs in China, there's no conviction for genocide there either, even though by definition they meet Lemkin's conception of genocide. What's missing is that specific intent. We might think they're there, but the courts, the judges, the international legal community has deemed it not so. This does not mean genocide has not occurred or is not occurring. That's not what I'm here to say. It just means that we have to be very careful when we say who has done it, where they've done it, and what their motivations were. And to that effect, part of the reason we have to be careful is because, let's be honest, genocide is a stigma. It is considered the crime of all crimes. And why is it so? It doesn't have to be. It was not designed by Lemkin himself, by Lauterpacht, by anybody, to be the highest of all crimes. We have two other major crimes under international law, crimes against humanity and war crimes, that are equally as powerful. This is not what Lemkin wanted. He did not want to see a hierarchy of international legal crimes in this way. Philippe Sands, who I mentioned, the international lawyer, said genocide was not meant to be the premier league of horrors. It was never meant to be elevated in this way. He says that we must eliminate this hierarchy because it has no social utility. So if what you seek under international law is justice, justice for Ukrainians, justice for Palestinians, the argument is you can achieve that through conviction of war crimes and crimes against humanity. It doesn't have to be genocide. But for whatever reason, our own biases maybe, cultural, who knows, we cling to genocide as that's the one that we have to get them with because that's the biggest one, that's the worst one. That's not the case. It wasn't intended that way by its designers, by the framers, or by the judges in the legal community. But we have to still rationalize, figure out how we're going to rationalize evolving standards of law over time. It does appear as if this is victor's justice, right? The powerful get to decide who's guilty of what. And it is. That is the case. We have to be comfortable with that, as lopsided and uncomfortable as it feels. And then we have to ask ourselves, right, what grievances then can this trigger? If we stay true to Lemkin's definition, then we can find examples of genocide everywhere. One could, and it needn't be limited to international law, because the international law will reach into a country's system to hold leaders to account when it fails to do so on its own. For example, look at the Trump administration's raids on the immigrant community. Arguably, they are a protected group under the ICC and the ICJ. They are being targeted. Those who are naturalized citizens, like myself, I was born in Iran. I have to wonder, could my citizenship be revoked by Homeland Security or the Justice Department through some executive order, because Congress won't hold the president to account and the courts won't do it. So under the ICC, ICJ definition, I would be part of a protected class. So we have to be careful when we talk about genocide. We have to understand the distinction between the rhetorical and colloquial use of the word and the legal definition and the application of the word. And as I was working on this discussion last week, and we had the tragic incident of the murder of Charlie Kirk, and these are some of the headlines that have been in major outlets the last few days. You see the New Yorker writing, "Did Trump just declare war on the American left?" The Wall Street Journal saying, "Charlie Kirk's death unites a global right that sees its movement under siege." Fox News, Congressman Chip Roy demands a new committee to probe radical left in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination. Meaning, if a government decides to turn against its own people, who it sees as a threat in the way that we have seen historically going back to 1939, if not before, what is the role of international law in protecting those citizens, those people? But I will note, the left is not a protected class. Liberals are not a protected class any more than any other political group is. Should they be? When we start defining the law and protections based on groups, we are in some ways feeding into the polarization that we are suffering from today, both nationally and internationally. The partisanship, all of the toxicity that we see centered on group identity. What group are you affiliated with? Was the shooter part of Antifa? Was the shooter part of the trans community or LGBT community? All of these things, when we divide and we put victims into these groups and we move away from the louder pact preference, which is to treat them as individuals who are being denied rights, then we run the risk of such things, classification that can backfire and raise additional grievances down the line. That's what we have to be careful about. So I have this conception I came up with. I'm going to call it the intent identity matrix. And it basically, it's an axis where you have intent on the y-axis, you have identity on the x-axis. At the high end of intent, you have a high threshold. You have to show that someone did this act with the intent, let's say if it's genocide or war crimes, with the intent to destroy. Alternatively, you have a low threshold. For identity, we can look at from the spectrum runs from the individual all the way to the group. The point of this is that we have to decide both as a country, but as a broader international community, when it comes to protecting rights and limiting what nations can do in war and in peacetime, where do we want our laws to fall on this matrix? Where do we want international law to fall when it's time to protect the individual or the group? And we have to be able to make that distinction. Okay, that's it. Sorry? Q&A.
Okay, we will, well, we have a lot of hands, so we will start. Actually, I'll ask the first question. You mentioned international law as though there's international law, but to what extent is international law just a theory, a discussion, a template? I mean, who is bound by international law? It certainly does not seem to carry the weight of national law in just about any country.
Yeah, that's a good question. And as I tell my students when I teach a class on international law, I basically say it doesn't exist. And the reason it doesn't exist is because there's no real enforcement mechanism. You look at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, created by the Rome Statute. The United States is not a member. Russia is not a member. China is not a member. Iran is not a member. Israel is not a member, right? There's so many other countries. So what good are these laws if countries aren't buying in and signing on? Even the International Court of Justice under the UN, the United States has not formally adopted it. And if the ICJ, a UN tribunal, let's say, holds Donald Trump guilty of some international criminal act, who's to think he would get arrested in this country? He wouldn't. He wouldn't be deported to a court somewhere in The Hague. So that's the problem with international law. It's not like domestic law. There is no enforcement mechanism. There's no way to execute. There's no executive branch that will make sure that anyone comes to justice. So we create these great ideas. We saw it work really well in Nuremberg. You want to know why? Because the Allies forced the Nazis to show up. They arrested them, put them in handcuffs, and in every picture you see of Nuremberg, the Nazi defendants are surrounded by military guards. They can't go anywhere. That's why it worked.
Questions? Let's start with Dick.
Thank you. Now, the Israeli government and the Hamas group are both dedicated to the complete abolition of the other. And one's a state and the other isn't. Does that affected, or is it just symmetrical that they're both basically doing the same thing?
That is an example of rhetorical or colloquial, if you're referring to this idea of genocide. If you have the Prime Minister of Israel, or better yet, members of his cabinet, making very open declarations about the elimination of an entire group and forced relocation, ethnic cleansing, that is rhetorical genocide. That does not mean that their actions are themselves genocidal, but you can definitely include that in the argument that you make in front of the International Court. And the International Court has to weigh all the evidence and say, we can't see any other motivation. So until that happens, rhetoric and speech does not equal specific intent. It's not enough. It wasn't in Serbia, it wasn't in Rwanda, it wasn't anywhere else in the world.
Professor, I have a couple of quick questions. I'll try. You talk about the UN Genocide Panel. Who constitutes it, and what are the qualifications to be on it? You say the Palestinians lack a state to protect their interests. Is that really only because they refuse to accept any proposal that leaves Israel in charge of a square centimeter of land? And since you're a lawyer, so you know that a law that is constitutional on its face is rendered unconstitutional by uneven application. And really, isn't that what we're seeing here? You talk about academics, but there's also reality.
Okay, so let me pick two of your favorites.
I'll let you choose.
Okay, let me start with the question of, so the first question is one that it's the UN tribunals are made up of judges who are selected. There's a committee process that's involved. There's a voting process that's involved. There's a whole system which you can find easily. I don't need to get into it here. But the second question is the one that's interesting to me in particular, which is the Palestinians lacking a state. Is it because they have not accepted one that was offered to them? The Palestinian statehood issue is a complicated one. It's not that black and white. You had, for years, the lack of a Palestinian nationalist movement. You had Arab states who benefited from preventing that from happening. Arab states did not want to see a Palestinian state. I mean, let's be honest. From 1948 to 1967, Jordan controlled the West Bank, Egypt controlled Gaza, Syria controlled the Golan Heights. Why didn't they create a state in those 19 years? They didn't want to. They could have done it. They had full control. They didn't want to. It wasn't in their interest. Not until the Khartoum summit, about 20 years later, 10 years later, 15 years, did all of a sudden Palestinian nationalist aspirations come to the fore, and the Arabs decided, okay, you know what, we can't co-opt this anymore. But it's a complicated history. So the occupation that began in '67 happened because it substituted one occupation for another. Israel occupied what Jordan had occupied and what Egypt had occupied. So that statehood question and sovereignty and their ability to represent their legal interests has been complicated by that. What's happened since then is a fault of both sides. I would say that easily with a straight face.
I would like to ask you to expand a little further on the deliberate exclusion of political groups as a category of genocide or even of war crimes, because historically, political groups, for example, during the dictators in Latin America during the 1970s, were persecuted and slaughtered for their political beliefs. In the United States, something similar is in process, if you will.
Yes. Lemkin wanted political groups included. Absolutely he did. But the powers that be, again, in particular, the United States, United Kingdom, and even the Soviet Union were opposed to this idea for obvious reasons. They didn't want to empower political groups to have international standing to bring charges against their leadership, just because they were in disfavor. So imagine if you allowed political groups. You could argue that during the 1950s, during the Red Scare, the members of the Communist Party in the United States absolutely could have and should have brought charges against the Eisenhower administration, the Truman administration, so on and so forth, charges of crimes against humanity, or even genocide for that matter. And so you could see why those governments had no interest in empowering political groups and giving them legal standing in that way. It would just open them up to liability, and they just weren't willing to do it.
I've been thinking a lot about starvation and famine that seem to have become weapons of war. And in some ways, starvation seems to fit easily into your genocide with perhaps, bodily harm, physical destruction, but perhaps questionable intent in some points. How does starvation, that seems to be used now more frequently by groups or by states, fit into your framework, and is it also perhaps war crimes or crimes against humanity rather than genocide?
It is the latter two, and it's relative.
Very intelligent, very thought-provoking presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you help us understand why the relinquishment of state sovereignty as a result of treaties, as a result of the European Union, has some success, whereas the ICC has little or no success?
It's easier in homogeneous systems and communities that share a history, a culture, a language, an identity, an ethno-racial component. It works in Europe under the European Union for those reasons. This is a continent that has been involved in some, the most destructive wars in human history. And so they have decided for their own good, they are going to enter into these agreements and enforce them among its members, and it's been successful. ICC is attempting to do it with countries all over the world. And that is where you diversify that group, you run into these obstacles.
Okay. One final question from me, actually. Since you're here, I don't want to waste one of the foremost experts on Iran without at least asking a question about Iran. So can you give us very quickly your view on what was the impact of the airstrike on Iran, and what are the prospects for regime change in Iran anytime soon?
The impact of the airstrikes is still being assessed. It set back Iran's nuclear development at least by a couple years, at a minimum 6 to 8 months, but definitely a year. We now know that they were further along than they had claimed to be publicly, so there's that aspect of it. As far as the prospects for regime change, I can't stress this enough. As somebody who emigrated to this country under political asylum because of the '79 revolution, regime change has to come from within. And that means that there has to be a weakening of the systems and structures of support for the Islamic Republic, the clerical apparatus, the Revolutionary Guard, all of the powers that are protected and rewarded by the system. Those edifices, that scaffolding has to crack, and that has to happen from within. There is nothing Israel, the United States, anyone can do to accelerate that. In fact, they can do a lot to delay that and defer that, but that it needs to happen from within. And I know that there's a lot of sentiment by Iranians living in the United States that the US should be more active in bringing about regime change, and that simply will not endure. It won't hold, and it won't be seen as organic and genuine. And for it to be broadly popular, and you need that popular support, it has to be organic.
Thank you, Professor Radd.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our next colloquium will be on October 15th, also on a Wednesday, and David Roloff will be taking over as your new curriculum director. David.
Gee whiz. Ta-da. Next month, we're doing Let's Talk About DEI by Professor Sean Harper, who's from the University of Southern California. We had to counter the UCLA guy today, so we go uptown. Harper is like one of these guys. His resume is like this and this and this and this. So he has a brand new book about the topic.
Relatively easy to show that states and non-states engage in siege tactics all the time. Starvation is a strategy, is a tactic used in siege warfare. That doesn't make it okay. And where, for example, the Israelis will run into complications is that if they continue what they're doing, and the starvation, the crisis continues, it'll become harder and harder for the judges eventually when they hear the case to look at this and see any other conclusion, any other motivation other than, okay, you are trying to kill all these people, because if you really wanted to engage in siege tactics and starve Hamas, if you will, you would have done it this way, this way, this way, this way. But by doing it wholesale, we can't see any other conclusion, any other motivation. So it becomes difficult. But that's to the crime of genocide. You can absolutely bring that under a war crimes charge or a crime against humanity. And my argument would be that should be enough. If what you're seeking is, if you genuinely believe that Israel has committed these crimes, it meets the definition under war crimes and crimes against humanity principles. And that's more than enough to convict and put away in some jail in The Hague Prime Minister Netanyahu, if that is what you wish. It doesn't have to be genocide. In other words, there's nothing special about genocide that elevates it above the others. That was the point that that international lawyers have been making, that Lemkin believed, that Lauterpacht believed. It should not be elevated in this way.
Thank you very much for a very important discussion today. Could you explain to us your thoughts on the use of the universal jurisdiction principle, which enables national courts anywhere in the world to enforce international law on individuals? Thank you.
It's great in theory until it's used against you or used against the government that you represent. It comes back to that question of sovereignty I brought up in the beginning. If states are truly sovereign, then we should not allow universal jurisdiction in that way, because it undermines this concept of state sovereignty. When we join a community of nations, almost in a John Lockean theory of social contract, do we accept that we're going to give up a bit of sovereignty in return for an international legal system that protects us? But for that to work, my answer would be you would have to protect people as individuals, not as groups, because then you run into the problem of who gets to define what is a protected group that enjoys universal jurisdiction and who is not. And until we've adopted an individualistic framework, you're going to run into problems.
The question of intent, does that have to be a deliberative act of commission, or can it be a deliberative act of omission? I raised that question because you said in Serbia, they were not convicted, not because of something they did, but because of something they didn't do.
Exactly. It has to be the specific intent to destroy, not to allow other people to destroy, and that is a very good question. To allow other people to destroy does not meet the threshold under the current interpretation, under the ICJ, but that could change. That could change. And what will cause it to change is if the next round of cases comes before the court, both the Russia-Ukraine case and the Israel-Palestine case, and they may decide we're going to lower the bar now.
Could you say something about why none of the Nazis was convicted of genocide? It seems like they were
I'm sorry, why?
Why the Nazis were not convicted of genocide? It seems like that's a sort of paradigm of genocide. The intent to destroy the whole people was very obvious in that case.
Yeah, that's a great question. The reason they were not convicted, Lemkin fought very hard with the committee, the tribunal, to have that included as one of the charges. Instead, they agreed to include it as an element, as a method of destruction, but not as a criminal charge itself. And again, the reason for that specifically was that the governments of the United Kingdom and the United States were concerned. The United States in particular said, if we allow this genocide crime to be invented and inserted, then we, the United States, could be prosecuted for genocide under existing Jim Crow laws and maltreatment of Black Americans and other groups, Native Americans, at that time. The United Kingdom, which was still an empire and had colonies abroad, was concerned for the same thing. What if then someone brings charges against them under that very same? So that's why they said we can't do this. So it's a classic example of victor's justice, of a double standard, of a hypocrisy. That's the reason. Yes.
Thank you very much for your comments. I'm just wondering, what disturbs me is that you've had almost 100 years of a construct that's not working. I don't understand that. What's the point? If you're not going to exact any kind of retribution or correction or remedy, why does it even exist? In the United States, we have, and not that this is a shining example, but we have different degrees for murder. And one of them is intent. Obviously, you have to prove that. And then at sentencing, if you are feeling bad about what you did, your sentence may be adjusted up to the judge's discretion. So again, getting back to my original question, why have a construct in place that does not work?
That is a great question, and I wish I had an answer, and it's a question that I get asked every semester when I teach the class. What's the purpose of all of this? Part of it is to make ourselves feel better, make ourselves feel like we have some set of rules in place after World War II, but you're right. What does that mean? And again, it comes down to sovereignty, and it comes down to the issue of, can one nation or a group of nations hold another sovereign state to account, even if that sovereign state agrees to subject itself to this thing called international law? Fine, we agree to it in theory, but then when that law comes for us, let's say, all of a sudden we don't want anything to do with it. And by the way, make me. Come and enforce it. Come into my home and take me. There is no enforcement mechanism. There is no, again, sort of executive or executory body that can enforce these laws, and that exposes its weakness. Now, to your point about the US criminal system, I've always felt that, yes, we should have under international law, idea of genocide in the first degree, genocide in the second degree, right? What does it mean? If you have these gradations, these standards, then I think it becomes easier to get convictions and to hold governments and people to account. But until we have that, it's either all or nothing. It's either this one big crime of genocide or not guilty of genocide. And we've seen that that doesn't work either.
Hasn't the term itself been so propagandized that it's really irrelevant anymore, and that governments are just using it as propaganda to put their case forward and trivialize the people that they're against? It started off, of course, after World War II, when they were discussing, of course, what the Germans did to the Jews. And now anything that ever happens is genocide. And we seem to be rhetorically going up and down, and it's a wonderful conversation among elites, but in actuality has been so prostituted that it's something that shouldn't even be considered anymore, and let's look for a different term or a different way of looking at international relations.
I don't know when and where and how this happened, other than it's been a gradual shift in the conversation over time, and I think it says a lot. If we had, let's say if the Nazis were held to account for the crime of genocide, that might have made this debate or discussion different, I don't know. But the fact that it hasn't, and the fact that for many people, they see some sort of historical justice and irony if, let's say in the case of Israel, a country that was founded on the ashes of an actual genocide is itself complicit in a genocide. It sort of completes the circle. For better or for worse. I can't explain it, but it is perplexing. And again, it goes contrary to what Raphael Lemkin had wanted. He never envisioned this becoming what it is today. It should not become the premier, the crime of all crimes. It was not designed to do that. It doesn't benefit anyone, any victims anywhere, to elevate it to that status.
A couple of questions on this side of the room now.
Thank you, and thank you for your comments. What I would like to know, well, it's been brought up, what's the sense of having the word genocide if none of these countries actions fit the definition of genocide? And the second question is, what about the word Holocaust? That is often used with respect to the German Nazis, the country, for committing what they did in the concentration camps. So is the word Holocaust interchanged? Because often when you see the literature, you'll see the two words.
Yeah. So Holocaust, right?
Exchanged.
Absolutely, and we've heard it used terms like nuclear holocaust and things of that nature. I can't answer the second question, but the first one, why do we even have it? Why does it exist if it's been so difficult to enforce? Because we need it as a deterrent. We need it so that we can say to countries and to leaders, there are laws on the books. If you do this thing, you will be held to account. The law is right there. It's clear what it is. You violate it, The argument the Nazis made was, you can't charge us with genocide because it's a crime you just invented. It didn't exist before World War II. They were right. It didn't exist. So you do have this principle in the law of ex post facto laws. You can't invent a law to punish someone for something that wasn't a crime when they did it. It's in our Constitution that such a law is banned. The Nazis made the same defense. That also complicated it. But that doesn't mean that we can't create that standard now going forward. And that's also a reason why it's there as a deterrent.
Okay. All right. Early on in your talk, you mentioned returning to the events of the last 7 to 10 days, and then you never kind of got back to it.
I was referring to the Charlie Kirk shooting. I was referring to the rhetoric now that if we feel that the rights, if there are acts done to, let's say, oppress, suppress, repress a certain class of Americans who hold certain political views, certain ideologies, if we go to this idea that groups should be protected and we expand that to include political groups, do we want to do that? Is there a need to do that when we're seeing the kind of rhetoric we're seeing from not just our administration, but also from the majority in Congress? Whatever your political beliefs are, this is something to think about. And this occurred to me as I was working on this lecture, was, okay, we're now seeing what happens when you take the concept of group justice to the extreme.
Okay. Well, actually, I thought that you were going to talk about the sinking of the Venezuelan boats, or whether that was a crime or not.
I had that in my notes to talk about that, and I just glossed over. But absolutely, that's another example. Yes.
Yeah, forgive me if you covered this, but are there any intent requirements for war crimes or crimes against humanity?
They are, but the special intent, the elevated special intent, is not as high, it's not as pronounced as it is for genocide. Every crime requires the underlying crime, the bad act, plus the mental state. The question is, what is the threshold of the mental state? For genocide, it's the highest of all of them.